Well, we've been looking these last 5 weeks at how we can be authentic in our walk as disciples of Jesus. And we've looked at different aspects, different facets of discipleship. And we said that we start with submission. We submit to Him, acknowledging that He is our master and that we are disciples who are following Him. And then we said that obedience to all that He purposes for us, that our will becomes aligned with His will, and that we are completely obedient to His will and purposes. And then we said that being a disciple must bear fruit as well, and that fruit must be visible. And so we looked at what that would be like. And then the last 2 weeks we've looked at longevity, saying that we need to stay the course. We need to be able to finish well. We need to be able to say like Paul that I've run the race and I've finished the course and I've kept the faith. And how important it is that we keep the faith, that we don't just check out and leave the race, but we stay in however difficult it might get. Today we wrap up the series on authentic discipleship, and I'm not at all suggesting that this has been just all that we need to think about. There's so much more as we look at the Word to understand what it means to be an authentic disciple, but I leave that to you. But for today, we have to talk about something that Jesus Himself said in terms of discipleship. And John 13 tells us in verse 34 and 35, John chapter 13, just 2 verses, 34 and 35, give us an important insight into how Jesus looked at the things that are important for us as disciples. It says this, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Okay? So He says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." And then He expands it and says, "Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." In other words, how has Jesus loved us? In that way, we need to love one another. But then He goes on and He says, "And the way that you love, by this, when people see the way you love one another, then they will know that you are my disciple." Then they will know that you are my disciple. Those are pretty strong words, isn't it? If we take them to heart and ask some of the hard questions. Do I love like that? Do I reflect Jesus? Does the world see me and say that I am a disciple of Jesus by the way that I love? So lots in just those 2 verses. And I'd like for us to unpack it and see what we can glean from other passages of Scripture that will help us understand this one. The first question that we need to ask ourselves when we see a verse like this is to say, if Jesus says, "Love as I have loved," how did Jesus love? Right? How did Jesus love His disciples? So let's look at 4 or 5 vignettes in His sojourn here on earth. The first one, and these are not chronological, just pick them out randomly. The first one is the washing of their feet. In John chapter 13, 1 through 17, we have that account. But in verse 3, it says, "Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into His hands, and that He had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside His outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around His waist. Then He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around Him." Washing of people's feet is not something that happens very often today, at least not in some of the cultures that we are aware of. It happens a lot more in African cultures that still hold this, do this very often. But feet washing in the time of Jesus was something that was very common. The only thing was that it was done by the help. It was done by servants. It was considered a menial thing, something that the least person would do for guests that arrived in a place. It wasn't something that a host would do. Never. A host would never wash the feet of people that came to him. And yet that's what Jesus did. It seems like he rose from supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water and began to wash the disciples' feet. And so we see, as we look to see what kind of love this is, it's a love that showed that there is nothing too low or nothing too demeaning that could be done with someone that you had to love. There was nothing that was too demeaning. That's a tough one, isn't it? Because all of us have an understanding of the way we love, but we also have a particular range in which we will love, right? We won't go beyond a particular range, nor will we go below a particular bar that we may have set. And within that range, we will love. But Jesus is saying that there is no lower bar. The lowest thing that you can think about is something that you do. The lowest thing. The thing that you think is too much, it's below your dignity to do, is the thing that needs to be brought into a loving relationship. Secondly, I want to look at the way in which he restored Peter. And we see, and I'm just reading, then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl came, seeing him as he sat in the light, and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I'm not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." And immediately Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're talking about." And the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Of all the lines in this passage, the one that really gets me is the one that says, "And the Lord turned and looked at Peter." And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. What a visual that must have been for Peter. To deny the Lord and then have to look into the eyes of the one whom he has denied. And yet, we see he went out and wept bitterly at that. But Jesus didn't leave it there, isn't it? We read in John chapter 21 that he restored the relationship with Peter. And those must have been terrible days for Peter, knowing that Jesus was alive, and yet knowing that he hadn't yet dealt with this whole idea of the denial. To carry that with you every time he met the Master and to know that he had denied him. Jesus hadn't asked him about it till that day on the shores of Galilee, when the only question he asked is, do you love me? Do you love me? 3 times he denied Jesus, and 3 times Jesus asked him, do you love me? In other words, the kind of love that Jesus showed was a love that accepted being hurt as a part of building a relationship. A love that forgave easily, and a love that restored fellowship. Love that was able to take in hurt and say, I still value the relationship. Thirdly, he gave Thomas a second chance in John 20:24, and I'm reading. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, Peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, Reach your finger here and look at my hands. And reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. What kind of love? A love that offers second chances, that takes the trouble to deal with unbelief and doubt. I want to just tell you, as we go through these different facets of love, that we're going to turn it on its head and look at ourselves in light of the way Jesus loved. And I want you just to look at it in terms of your immediate family, your immediate circle of friends or relatives or colleagues. Don't worry about people who you don't know, although the love that Jesus is talking about extends to them as well. But for now, just for us today, just think of the people that you know, the relationships that you have. Because when you think of Thomas, we don't very often give people a second chance, isn't it? It's not in our nature even. Once we've been hurt, or once we've had somebody do something, or the old adage says, once bitten, twice shy. Right? And that line has come because we are not willing to restore, to forgive. And Jesus could easily have walked away and said, man, I'm tired of Thomas. I mean, if he can't believe, he can't believe. That's it. No, he took the trouble to deal with Thomas. So love that gives second chances, that takes the trouble to deal with doubt and unbelief. And then fourthly, a love that has patience. We read in Luke 24 of the 2 disciples who were on the way to the village called Emmaus. And it says, Jesus kind of joins them and he says to them, what kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad? Then he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And then beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And they said to one another, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us?" It was not like Jesus, this was the first time Jesus was doing this, isn't it? He was with the disciples for 3 years. He taught them every day. And yet, they weren't able to connect the dots. They weren't able to see that the things that he had taught them from the Old Testament were things that talked about him. They couldn't make the connection. And even after he was resurrected, they didn't know. And yet Jesus was so patient with them. Call them foolish ones first, but I guess we can give Jesus that. But then he taught them, explained things to them until they say, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us?" A love that is patient. A love that continues to keep coming back. A love that doesn't give up on people. And then fifthly, he shows us how we ought to love our enemies. Luke 22:47 to 51 says, "But even as Jesus said this," that is, he's coming out of Gethsemane, he had just spoken to his disciples. It says, "A crowd approached led by Judas, one of the 12 disciples. Judas walked over to Jesus to greet him with a kiss. But Jesus said, 'Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?' When the other disciples saw what was about to happen, they exclaimed, 'Lord, should we fight? We brought our swords.' And one of them struck at the high priest's slave, slashing off his right ear. But Jesus said, 'No more. No more of this.' And then he touched the man's ear and healed him." Imagine, he touched the man's ear and healed him. I'm sure that, I won't speak for you all, okay? I'm sure if I was there, I would have looked at that ear and thought, well, good for you. You're going to be the one-eyed ear man as you walk around from now on. Can't fight all of you, but at least you don't have one ear. Enemy, somebody who's against Jesus, and he actually puts the ear back. Actually put the ear back. I'm sure that man was changed for life, right? Every time he touched his right ear, he was thankful it was still there. And he remembered why. He must have. And Jesus showed us what it means to be compassionate even to those who are against. Well, if we had to take Jesus' words to us, and he says, "I want you to love as I have loved," then we need to look at all of these 5 vignettes, if you would, and say, okay, how do I make that work in my life? As a disciple of Jesus, Jesus says, when people see the way you love is the way I love, then they will say, that's a disciple of Jesus. And we are looking at authentic discipleship. So how do we look at this? Well, first we saw a lot that showed that there's nothing too low to do, nothing too demeaning. I wonder whether it's worth looking at our own lives and asking the question, is there something that I will not do for a person I love? Is there something that I will not do for a person I love? And then challenge that position with the words of Jesus. And see if that is appropriate for a disciple of Jesus. There's something that I won't do. That's something I cannot do. I remember many years ago, I was about 24, 25, and we were getting ready for it was our first major concert. It was going to be held in an auditorium in downtown Mumbai, and we had invited the GAT quartet from Chennai, and so we had a choir. And I was in a friend's place getting ready because it was close in town. And I remember ironing my shirt, and then I was getting dressed, and then I looked down for my shoes and I couldn't find, and I was sure I had left it there just under the bed. And I started looking around when this friend of mine, a dear friend, we'd been together in school. He was actually 2 years my senior, was also the captain of the school. And he walked in with my shoes. And I looked at him and I took it from him, and I realized that he had taken it out and polished it and brought it back. I tell you, I nearly lost it. I couldn't imagine anybody taking my shoes, polishing it and bringing it back and giving it to me. Somebody who was older to me. He was a naval officer. I've never forgotten that. And it's always challenged me when I think about love and some things that you can't do. It's too low. I'm always reminded of this. But I wonder, beloved, as you look at your own relationships, is there something that you won't do for a loved one? Secondly, a love that accepts being hurt as part of building the relationship. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because we avoid people who hurt us, right? We cut them out of our lives. And yet it seems that even though being hurt and being resentful or angry or whatever with somebody, we see that that is something that we need to accept and say, for the greater joy and the future of our relationship, I'm going to let that go. I'm going to let that go. And I'm going to seek the relationship. It has far more value than the hurt I've received. And to be able to do that. And you know, in a situation like that, there's no place you can go with that hurt except to the cross. Isn't it? No place else. Because you have to leave that hurt somewhere. And the only place is at the foot of the cross and say, Lord, I've been hurt. Lord, would you take it? I don't want this to stand in the way of your commandment to love. You've heard me say this, but hurt that is not dealt with, or resentment that is not dealt with, leads to hurt. Hurt that is not dealt with will lead to anger. Anger that is not dealt with will lead to hatred. And hatred that is not dealt with will lead to bitterness. And bitterness is the most debilitating thing you can have in your heart. Because it's like rust. It eats from the inside. Even the strongest steel will crumble because it eats from inside. It hurts nobody but you. That's why we have to take the hurts to the cross. Take it to the one who understands, who went through hurt. And Jesus is saying, that's a love that I want from you as well. that you deal with the hurt and pursue the relationship. Then thirdly, we said a love that gives second chances, takes the trouble to deal with doubt, unbelief. And maybe in a relationship of friends, family, someone has doubted you. Somebody has doubted you and said, I don't think that that person can ever make it in life, or I don't think that person can take care of a family. Doubt your abilities or to believe in you. And may have said this even behind your back. And yet Jesus talks about love that goes after. And not leave things the way they are. We talk about all of these things and realize that our relationships are so fragile, right? Sometimes all it takes is one thing to break it, to cut people out of our lives. And yet Jesus went after Thomas. He could easily have said, forget Thomas. Right? He's on his own. But he didn't, and look what happened, right? Thomas came, as we believe, all the way to India. And who knows what a restored relationship can do for a person. You never know. Then we see a love that is patient. To be patient with someone. And maybe you're in a relationship or a situation where you have repeated something or told someone ad nauseum that this is the way it should be, or this is the way you should act, or something. Now you're at a point where you're saying, I'm done with this person. Just not possible to pursue this. And I wonder whether patience is what the Lord is placing upon your heart today. That says, I'm not done with you and you shouldn't be done with anybody. And then lastly, a love that has compassion even to those who are against you. Love that has compassion to even those who are against you. That's so difficult, isn't it, beloved? Because we want to avoid people like that. And the only way that we can have that kind of a love is to get it from God. Because the kind of love that we have, it's a love that is causal, as I've said before. It's a causal love. I love because. There's a reason why I do this. The agape love that Jesus is talking about is a non-causal love. It's a love that just loves. And the only way that we can love in this manner is to ask the King of Love to give it to us. The only way. So I wonder this morning as we make our way towards the table, whether this can be a place where we do business with God. Where we say, Lord, I haven't loved like the way that you want me to love. I haven't restored. I haven't gone after a relationship. I haven't done some of the things that you mentioned. But Lord, you're placing this upon my heart. And I wonder, as you come to the table, that you also spend just a quiet moment at the altar and say, Lord, I want to give up that. I want to leave a hurt behind, Lord. I want you to give me love for a person. I want you to help me in this restorative process, whatever it is. And I'm sure that the Holy Spirit is speaking right now to each of us, just placing His finger on areas in our life that we need to deal with today. And I really would like it, as you partake of the Lord's Supper, that if the Lord is speaking to you, that you just say, Lord, I've heard you. Lord, I want to come and then come and kneel at this altar. And then exchange it for whatever He wants you to exchange it, or walk away from here with fresh determination or confidence that He has met you. Amen.